you all know, in the 20th century, this country, all of us, made a resolution to end racial segregation. We began in the 1930s. Civil rights lawyers began by attacking racial segregation in law schools because they figured if judges were too stupid to understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then they used that precedent to attack segregation in colleges and universities. And they went on then to win a decision in 1954 that you all know, Brown versus Board of Education, to abolish segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And then that decision, that Brown decision, spurred a national civil rights movement that ended up by use not only of litigation, but of demonstrations and marches and civil disobedience, ending segregation and everything from lunch counters to interstate transportation to buses to water fountains. We understood that segregation, racial segregation, was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. We understood that it was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful to both African Americans and to whites, and that it was unconstitutional. And yet, after all of that, we've left untouched the biggest segregation of all. And that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, and clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. I mean, how could that be? How could we have left untouched at the end of the civil rights movement the biggest segregation of all, having devoted so much time and energy and sweat and blood to abolishing segregation in all of these other areas? Racial segregation in neighborhoods underlies most of the most serious social problems that we face in this country. I came to this work not as a housing expert, but as somebody who studied education policy. And I came to understand that the biggest cause of the problems in education that we all worry so much about, the achievement gap between disadvantaged and advantaged children, between black and white children, is attributed primarily to the fact that schools are segregated. When you concentrate children in single schools and single classrooms who are suffering from severe social and economic disadvantages, it's inconceivable that those schools and classrooms can achieve at the same level as schools that are serving children who are not suffering from those disadvantages. And I spent a lot of years writing about this topic, never really realizing the underlying causes of it. I tried to explain, for example, that African American children in this country in urban areas have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. If a child has asthma, the child is likely to come to school drowsy from being up wheezing at night, or sleepless, or maybe even absent. Asthma is the largest chronic cause of school absenteeism in this country today. And if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, 2 identical groups of children, except one group has a higher rate of asthma and therefore less attentiveness in school and more absenteeism and more drowsiness, that group is going to have lower average achievement, which is not to say that some children with asthma aren't going to achieve at higher levels than children without asthma. There's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic. But 2 groups of children equal in every respect, one with asthma, one with not. The one with asthma is going to have lower average achievement. And in my work, I went through example after example of this, of the concrete ways in which social and economic disadvantages translate into differences in student achievement, because the dominant narrative in this country when I was working on this, the 1990s and early 2000s, was that the only reason that we had an achievement gap was because teachers had low expectations of minority children. And I tried to explain that, no matter how high your expectations are, you can't make a sleepless child wide awake. And I talked about lead poisoning, which has a concrete impact on IQ, and stress, which biologically affects both cognitive and behavioral performance, stress that may result from severe personal, family, economic insecurity or exposure to violence. All of these factors, concentrated in single schools, is what is the major determinant of the achievement gap. And the schools are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So racial segregation in neighborhoods is the cause of our educational problems, or most serious cause of our educational problems. And yet we've spent now 30 years in the fruitless educational reform movements trying to address the symptoms without ever addressing the cause, which is residential segregation. And it's the cause of health disparities. African Americans have lower life expectancies than whites on average because they live in less healthy neighborhoods, more polluted neighborhoods, neighborhoods without access to fresh food or medical care or transportation to good jobs. It's the cause of certainly the violence that we see in places like Ferguson and Milwaukee and St. Paul and other cities in the country, and hundreds of cities in the last 50 or 60 years, riots and violence like that, because we're concentrating the most disadvantaged young men without access to good jobs, without transportation to good jobs, without hope, in single neighborhoods where they engage in oppositional behavior and informal economic activity that attracts the attention of the police and frequently the violent attention of the police. And of course, racial segregation is a contributing factor to the disastrous, and who knows where it will lead, political polarization that we have in this country today, when African Americans and whites live so distant from one another, they can't possibly have empathy with each other, understand the different life experiences that each are experiencing. We would not have that political polarization if it weren't for racial segregation. So how is it that we have left untouched the biggest segregation of all, even though it's the cause of so many of our most serious social problems? And I think, well, there's one way to see it. It's harder to address residential segregation than it is to address water fountain segregation, or park segregation. I just realized, the first place I was ever arrested was in Gwynn Oak Park, I think, in 1963. Here I am in Baltimore again. Until he was asked me if I'd ever been in Baltimore before. I guess that was once. But how, it's harder to address residential segregation than amusement park or recreational park segregation. If we abolish segregation in parks, the next day you can go to any park. If we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done as a nation, and I mean all of us, not just conservatives, but liberals, whites and blacks, all of us have adopted a national myth, a rationalization that excuses us from addressing this insidious form of segregation, for not excusing us from not completing the civil rights revolution that we began in the 20th century. And that myth is that unlike all the other segregations that we addressed in the 20th century, this one is different because this one wasn't created by government. This one was only created by private prejudice. White homeowners wouldn't sell homes in their neighborhoods to African Americans, or real estate agents and banks refused to sell homes or issue mortgages to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it's just because people just like to live with each other of the same race. Or maybe it's because African Americans typically have lower incomes than whites and can't afford to live in middle-class neighborhoods. I mean, all of these individual personal decisions, private acts of discrimination, it's what's caused this form of segregation. And we think it's too bad. None of us thinks that racial segregation of neighborhoods is a good thing. We think it's too bad, but we say there's nothing we can do about it because if it's the action of private individuals, it's not remediable. What happened by accident can only be undone by accident. And the Supreme Court has ratified that view, but it didn't start with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ratified that view, and they've given a name to it. The name they give to it is that what we've got when it comes to residential segregation is de facto segregation. It's a term we all use. And the Supreme Court says that if you have de facto segregation as opposed to segregation created by government, not only is there nothing you can do about it, there's nothing you're permitted to do about it. You cannot explicitly remedy something that was created by private activity. That's the Supreme Court view, and we've all adopted it, without exception. As I say, I began this work from a background in education policy, and in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision in which the Supreme Court evaluated a desegregation program that was being run in 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. And in both of those school districts, they had very token desegregation plans. They allowed students a choice of which school to go to, but if the choice was going to further imbalance the school racially, that choice would not be honored in favor of a choice of a child who had helped to desegregate a school. And it was a trivial program. You couldn't imagine a more trivial effort to desegregate than this one. Most children don't want to go to school outside their own neighborhoods and away from their friends. And besides, the cases where you have one place left in the school and both a white and a black child apply for that one last place is trivial. How could you have a more trivial program? But the Supreme Court got up in arms about this, and they said this was outrageous. It was a violation of the Constitution to have this kind of program. And Chief Justice John Roberts issued the opinion, and he said that the reason that the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. And then he went on to say that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto for all of the private reasons I just mentioned, and we have de facto segregation. We can't remedy it. Well, I remembered reading this case about a situation in Louisville, Kentucky, some years before, in which a white homeowner living in a single-family home in a suburb of Louisville called Shively had an African-American friend, a decorated Navy veteran who was married, had a child, had a good job, was living in what we now call the inner city of Louisville, an African-American neighborhood. And that African-American friend couldn't find a home, couldn't buy a home in a suburb where he wanted to live because no real estate agent would sell it to him. And so the white homeowner bought another home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. This was in Louisville, Kentucky, the place that Chief Justice John Roberts said was de facto segregated. And when the African-American family moved into this home, a mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. The mob threw rocks through the windows. The police somehow couldn't identify any perpetrators. They firebombed and dynamited the home. And when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much like de facto segregation. There must be something about Louisville that John Roberts doesn't understand. And I began to wonder whether this was an isolated case of the judicial system and the police and the prosecutorial forces being used to enforce residential segregation, whether this was an isolated incident or whether there was more to the story. And I had read some other books about this but never put it all together, but I began a bit of research, and it resulted in the book that you've heard about, The Color of Law, that concludes that de facto segregation is an utter myth. There is no reality to it whatsoever. The residential segregation that exists in every metropolitan area in this country is a result of very explicit, racially explicit policy on the part of the federal, state, and local governments explicitly designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any city in this country. The policies that were followed by the federal, state, and local governments were so powerful that they determine the racial landscape of today, even though those policies themselves are no longer being followed for the most part. And so it's important that we understand this history, because if in fact de facto segregation is a myth, if in fact residential segregation is as unconstitutional, as much a violation of civil rights as the segregation of Gwynn Oak Park was 50 years ago or 55 years ago, or as water fountains or buses or schools were, then as American citizens, all of us, we have an obligation to remedy it. We have a constitutional obligation to remedy it. It's not something that we can, in conscience, as American citizens, allow to continue. So let me spend a few minutes this evening, I guess it's the evening by now, describing some of the most powerful policies that the government followed. There were many, many of them. I've described many of them in my book. I can't possibly go into many of them here this evening, but let me describe a couple of the most powerful ones. One that I like to talk about, because it's surprising to so many people, is the public housing program of this country. Public housing, as Antonia mentioned before, began as a program for middle-class, working-class families. It wasn't for poor people. Poor people weren't permitted into public housing when it first began in the 1930s during the New Deal as an anti-depression measure. You had to show that you were employed, that you were among the 75% of the workforce that was employed. The 25% that was unemployed in the Depression was not eligible for public housing. You had to have a stable employment history. You had to demonstrate to social workers who worked for public housing agencies that you had good furniture that wouldn't degrade the quality of the public housing project. That's what public housing was. The Public Works Administration, one of the first New Deal agencies, built public housing in cities across the North and the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic states. And everywhere it built it as segregated, separate projects for whites and blacks, not just for, they were all working class. This was not subsidized. The public housing projects in the 1930s were all paid for in the rent of the people who were living there. But separate projects for blacks and whites, frequently creating segregation in neighborhoods that had previously been integrated. Now, this may surprise you, but in the mid to early 20th century, there were many integrated neighborhoods in urban areas in this country, many more than there are today. We'd be stunned if we were transported back to that era to see the extent of urban integration that existed. It existed for the simple reason that most workplaces were located in downtown areas. The factories had to be near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts or to ship their final products. And if those factories, if a factory district or a warehouse district happened to employ African American workers and Irish immigrant workers and Italian immigrant workers and Jewish immigrant workers and rural migrants, those workers all had to live in the same neighborhoods. They didn't have cars to drive to work. They had to be able to walk to work or take short streetcar rides. So they had integrated neighborhoods. The Public Works Administration began to demolish housing in those neighborhoods to create separate projects, creating a pattern of segregation in cities that otherwise might never have developed with the strength that it did. In my book, I like to refer to the autobiography of the great African-American poet and novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes. Some of you may have read it. It's called The Big C. In The Big C, Hughes describes how he grew up in Cleveland in an integrated neighborhood, an integrated downtown neighborhood. As I say, we don't think of Cleveland, downtown Cleveland, as being an integrated place. But he grew up in an integrated downtown neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. This was not unique in early to mid-20th century America. The Public Works Administration came into that neighborhood of Cleveland, it's called the Central Neighborhood of Cleveland, near downtown, and built separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in Cleveland and with other segregated projects in Cleveland that never would have had the force that it did. And this happens, as I say, all over the country. In my book, I like to refer where I can to self-satisfied places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example. In Cambridge, the area between Harvard and MIT was in the 1930s an integrated neighborhood. It was about half black and half white. The Public Works Administration demolished housing there and built separate projects for whites and blacks, creating a pattern of segregation with those and other projects in the Boston area that created a pattern of segregation that otherwise would never have developed. During World War II, the work of the federal government to create segregation intensified. Hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production during World War II to take jobs that hadn't existed in the Depression. They overwhelmed the communities where these war plants were located, and if the government wanted ships and tanks and aircraft to be built for the war effort, it had to somehow find housing for these workers. And in my book, again, I like to refer to another self-satisfied place, Berkeley, California. A suburb of Berkeley, a small suburb of Berkeley, just north of Berkeley, is called Richmond, which became the center of shipbuilding during World War II in the West Coast. Richmond was a tiny community, 20,000 prior to World War II, all white, a few African Americans who were related to Pullman car porters who were based in Oakland, were working as domestics in the white homes of Richmond, but there was no African American population there. Indeed, across the entire West Coast, up and down the entire West Coast, there was very, very small African American population prior to World War II. Historians like to divide the migration of African Americans from the South to the North into two great migrations. The first migration in and after World War I, and then the second great migration that began from this migration of war workers in World War II. But the second great migration was the first time that substantial numbers of African Americans came to the West Coast. Well, Richmond, as I say, was a tiny community, white community of 20,000. By the end of the war, there were 100,000 workers in the shipyards at Richmond. And if you think of their families, probably an influx of 300,000 people into this community of 20,000 and overflowing into Berkeley and a few other small communities nearby. I don't know how you grow a community from 20,000 to 300,000 in a period of 4 years. The only way you can do it is by the federal government beginning a massive public housing program, and they did. And in this community, which had never known segregation before, the federal government built separate housing for war workers. These were workers who were working in the same shipyards. They were working together, but the federal government built separate housing for the white workers and the black workers. It built housing for the black workers in the industrial area and the railroad tracks along the bay in Berkeley and in Richmond. That was for the black workers. The city of Richmond announced that they didn't have to build permanent housing there because any African Americans who came to Richmond during the war would have to leave at the end of the war, whereas the white workers who came were welcome to stay, and public housing was built for them in the more residential areas of the city. And in this way, with these and many, many other projects, war projects, a pattern of segregation was created for the first time up and down the West Coast, in Seattle and in Portland and in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Los Angeles. Well, after World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage. Not only had no housing been built during the Depression except for these Public Works Administration and other public projects that were built, but during World War II, it was actually unlawful to use construction materials to build civilian housing. The only housing that could be built was for war workers. And then there were hundreds of millions, actually, millions of returning war veterans coming back to this country to return to their families after the war and needing housing. There was an enormous housing shortage. Returning veterans were living in Quonset huts. They were doubled up with families, getting on the nerves of their mothers-in-law and vice versa. It was a real national crisis. And so President Truman, who was the successor to Roosevelt, proposed a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program. And remember, we're still talking about public housing for working class families, not for poor people. This is for returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war boom. They could afford to pay rent, but there was no housing available for them. And so President Truman proposed a vast expansion of the public housing program. And conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat President Truman's efforts. And they wanted to defeat it not because, for racial reasons, the public housing was understood, was always segregated. They didn't object to that. And it wasn't because they didn't like poor people, because poor people weren't allowed into public housing. It was, the basis of their opposition was they said that public housing was socialistic. And the private sector should be taking care of the needs of returning war veterans. But of course, the private sector wasn't doing so. That's why we had this national crisis. But in any event, they came up with a device to try to defeat the 1949 Housing Act. And it's a device that we term a poison pill strategy. I don't know if many of you are familiar with that term, but a poison pill strategy in Congress is an effort by opponents of a bill to attach an amendment to the bill which makes, which can get passed, which has majority support. But once the amendment is combined with the total bill becomes unpalatable to a new majority, and it goes down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment to the 1949 Housing Act that from now on, public housing has to be integrated. No more segregation in public housing, no more racial discrimination in public housing. It was a cynical move on their part. Of course, they didn't want public housing at all. But they figured they would vote for this amendment. They would be joined by Northern Democrats, enough Northern Democratic liberals to get the amendment passed. And then when the full housing bill came up before the floor of Congress, with this integration amendment, a non-discrimination amendment attached, the conservatives would flip and vote against the entire bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats. That would create a new majority against public housing. And the entire bill would go down to defeat. So Northern liberals campaigned against the integration amendment. They were led by Mr. Civil Rights in the United States Senate, Hubert Humphrey, a name that maybe some of you will remember, and by another very prominent liberal at the time, a colleague of Humphrey's, Paul Douglas, a senator from Illinois. They campaigned against the integration amendment in order to preserve public housing. Paul Douglas got up on the floor of the United States Senate and gave a speech, which I quote in my book, that went something along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off with this segregated program as is before Congress than you will with no housing, no public housing at all, which will be the result if this amendment is passed." In retrospect, I'm not so sure that we are better off having made this devil's bargain to create much needed housing. It was not an easy choice to make. There was a desperate housing shortage. But to create segregated housing to solve this desperate need for housing in a way that perpetuated and reinforced to a greater extent than it ever existed before the segregated landscape that exists in every metropolitan area today. And as a result of the 1949 Housing Act, some of the public housing projects that we're most familiar with around the country, the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, Cabrini Green in Chicago, Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, some of you may remember that project, were built under the 1949 Housing Act as segregated projects. Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis was two separate projects. Pruitt was for African Americans. Igoe was for whites. We now call it the Pruitt-Igoe projects. It was two projects, not one. Very soon after these projects were built, all across the country, a development occurred which was quite surprising. And that is that in all of these projects, and I mean all of them, everywhere in the country, large numbers of vacancies suddenly developed in the white projects. There was this enormous housing shortage, and yet they couldn't fill the white projects. And long waiting lists in the black projects. Pretty soon, the situation became so untenable. You couldn't have projects in the same city, some of which were largely vacant and the other which had long waiting lists. And so the government and local housing agencies opened up all of the projects to African Americans. Soon, all public housing was dominated by African Americans. Few whites were living in it. I'm summarizing, oversimplifying a little bit the story, but African Americans began to populate public housing. At about the same time, you remember what I said about all the integrated neighborhoods existing because all jobs were located in the downtown areas. About the same time, industry left the cities. They no longer needed to locate their plants near deep water ports or railroad terminals because highways were being built. And they could get their parts and ship their final products by truck. And jobs disappeared. African Americans living in public housing had less and less access to good jobs. They became poorer and poorer. Soon the government had to start subsidizing their rents in a way it hadn't done before. Once the government started subsidizing their rents, it stopped investing in the projects, stopped maintaining them. The quality of the projects deteriorated, and we got the kinds of concentrated public slums that we all associate with public housing today. The question that I hope is running through your mind at this point is, why did all the vacancies occur in the white projects and not in the African American ones? These were all returning war veterans. They all had jobs in the post-war economy. There was an enormous housing shortage. Why did that happen? And that was primarily because of another federal program, which was just as powerful as the federal housing program, public housing program, and creating segregation. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration that was explicitly designed to suburbanize the entire white working class population into single-family homes and suburbs outside the cities. This was a racially explicit program. These were all white suburbs by regulation, and the Federal Housing Administration created subsidies, ways of getting whites to move out of not only public housing, but of rented apartments in cities into single-family homes in the suburbs. You're familiar with all these suburbs. There are hundreds and hundreds of them. You know that in the 1940s and 50s, the great suburbanization of the American white working class took place. The most famous of these projects, but they're in Baltimore and they're in every city in the country, every Baltimore County and every metropolitan area in the country. The most famous of them is Levittown, east of New York City. I'm sure you've heard of that one. 17,000 homes. 17,000 homes for working class families, very modest homes, 750 square feet, very, very modest homes. But no bank would be crazy enough to lend William Levitt the money to buy land and build 17,000 homes in one place for which he yet had no buyers. Where was he going to get the financing to build that development? And this was true of developers of suburban subdivisions all over the country. Some of you may remember a song Pete Seeger sang. It was written by Malvina Reynolds about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. This was a song written about a suburb that was just as big as Levittown, south of San Francisco. And from San Francisco to Nassau County in New York, and in hundreds and hundreds of places in between, similar projects were built. The only way that Levitt could get the funds to build this project, or Henry Dolger, the developer of the little boxes on the hillside, or any of these other developers, was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, making an explicit commitment to the Federal Housing Administration that they would never sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt and these other developers to put a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working in the Federal Housing Administration. It was written policy. The Federal Housing Administration had something called an underwriting manual, which was distributed to appraisers all over the country, guiding them in how to determine whether to issue these bank guarantees to developers with proposals for subdivisions. And the underwriting manual prohibited bank guarantees to developers who were going to sell homes to African Americans. It even prohibited guarantees to developers who would build an all-white subdivision in an area that was close to where African Americans were living, because in the language of the federal manual, such a development would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. This was written federal policy. As a result of this policy, white working class families, returning war veterans, and other white working class families were able to leave the cities and move into these suburban homes, these modest suburban homes. They were very inexpensive. They sold in the mid-20th century for $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a piece. In today's money, that's about $100,000, twice national median income. Any working class family, white or black, can afford to buy a home for $100,000 today. In fact, the white families who were not only permitted but encouraged and subsidized to buy these homes could move out of public housing, which you remember was not subsidized, could move out of public housing and pay less in their monthly housing costs than they were paying for rent in public housing when they moved into these single-family homes with an FHA or a VA mortgage. And if they were returning war veterans, no down payment was required. Well, I said at the beginning that these policies that the government followed to create segregation were so powerful, that they determine the racial landscape of today. Those homes, to give this example, those homes, as I say, they sold for about $100,000 in the mid-20th century. Today, homes in Levittown or Westlake, the little boxes on the hillside, or any of these other developments typically sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, depending on the area of the country. 6, 7 times national median income, no longer affordable to working class families of either race. The white families who moved into these homes became middle class. They gained equity from the appreciation and the value of their homes. Most Americans gain what wealth they have from the equity they have in their homes. It's only the very rich who get wealthy by playing the stock market. White families gained this wealth, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, maybe more. They used it to send their children to college. They used it to take care of emergencies, whether medical or temporary unemployment. They used it to subsidize their own retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who were explicitly prohibited by federal policy from participating in this wealth-generating program gained none of that wealth. They were required to continue renting apartments in urban areas, whether in public housing or in the private market. Today, on average, African American incomes are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. That's a gap, 60%. But you would expect that if there was a 60% income ratio, there would be a 60% wealth ratio. Families are capable of saving the same amount of money from the same incomes. In reality, while African American incomes are 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is 10% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and that has never been remedied. And that we have never, and I mean all of us, we have never made an effort to remedy. That wealth gap determines the social inequalities that I described at the beginning of this talk, and it continues to perpetuate the racial segregation that we have today, even though those Federal Housing Administration policies are no longer being followed. We passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of that Fair Housing Act this year. I think it was actually a bit premature. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, but we didn't add enforcement mechanisms to it until 1988, so it's really the 30th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. But in any event, we passed the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act said to African Americans, in effect, that, okay, you can now live in Levittown. You can now live in Westlake. You can now live in any of these places. But they're unaffordable to working class families of either race. As a result of the Fair Housing Act, to take Levittown as an example, about 2% of the population of Levittown is now African American. In a broader area, that's about 15% African American. So the Fair Housing Act was able to take care of part of this problem, but not very much of it. There are many, many policies. It's easy. It's really easy to think of policies we could follow to desegregate this country residentially. Developing the policy ideas is not hard. What's hard is developing the consensus, the political will, the new civil rights movement that may engage not only in litigation and in understanding history, but in all of the tactics that previous civil rights movements engaged in, developing the new consensus that's going to force these changes. There are many policies, as I said. Once we understand their obligation and accept that obligation to undertake this task, developing the policies are quite easy. In my book, I describe some examples of policies we could follow. Some of them are expensive, some of them are costless. As I say, they're easy to develop. Maybe if I can talk about some of them in the question period. I'm really out of time now. I could ramble on about this history for the next 3 years if you would put up with me, but I think you get the idea. De facto segregation is an utter myth. We have an unconstitutional system of residential boundaries. It's a civil rights violation. As American citizens, all of us have an obligation to do something about it, and I hope that you will do so. Thank you very much.